One of the challenges in translating anime and games is character names. Now you might have heard that Japanese names sometimes have meanings behind them. Like Aiko can mean lovely or beautiful or sweet child, depending on how it is written in kanji, but it goes much, much deeper than that. So I wanted to just talk about in this video about some of the challenges that I come across as an anime and game translator when I'm dealing with names. So first off, shout out to my newest patron, Andrew Soto. Thank you very much for supporting. If you want to support me on Patreon, go ahead and click on the link below. Or don't, whatever. So the first challenge that I have when translating names is that oftentimes people in Japan call each other by their last name, not their first name. And it does not have the same connotation that it does in the United States or in other Western countries when we call each other by our last names. And I'm not talking about last name san or chan or kun or any of that. No honorifics. I'm just talking about you're calling me by my last name instead of my first name. When we do it in America, it's oftentimes like a jock sort of thing to do. The general manager of the last comedy sports that I belong to, we called him just by his last name. No mister, just his last name solidly as if it were his first. And sometimes it can have this sort of like joking sort of feel to it. Like there was a friend I had in college and we called each other by our last names, which is kind of how we addressed each other, and it was our little special way of addressing each other, and it was kind of silly. But in Japan, it's not necessarily a jockey thing, and it's not necessarily a silly thing to just call someone by their last name. It's definitely a little bit familiar and would be rude if I'm just calling some person that I'm not really that close with, like just by their last name with no honorific at all. But it just has a slightly different feel to it. It's not quite the same as it is in the Western world. So it is sometimes incorrect to translate it that way, to translate it as a character calling another character just by their last name. Oftentimes the better thing to do is to translate it as the character calling the other character by their first name. So I mentioned it earlier, but honorifics, that is the second thing that's really tough about translating names, and it's something that most anime fans know a lot about, and it's where a lot of the literal translation fans and the non-literal, the loose or the localized translation fans get in arguments like, oh, should you include the kun, san, chan, sama? Should you include those honorifics in the subtitles or in the translations, or should they be left out? I am of the mindset that they should be left out unless this is an extremely, extremely niche and extremely Japanese series that's just so Japanese, and unless the honorifics like become part of puns or something. I think in 95% of the cases the honorifics should just be left out entirely and translated, localized into something that makes more sense to Western folks. And I have a whole video talking about why I think that is, but to recap, for one thing, honorifics are not what a lot of people think they are. San is not Ms. or Miss or Mr. It's not. It's not necessarily a sign of like respect in the same way that it would be a sign of respect in our language. It's more like if there's a person that's a year older than I am, if I have a friend named Emily and she's a year older than I am, and if I address her and we're not close friends and I address her just as Emily and not Emily-san, that could be seen as rude. Not using the san, not using some kind of honorific to acknowledge, yes, she is older than I am and therefore her status is higher than mine. Even if we are friends though, that's the other thing that a lot of people misunderstand. Even if I am friends with Emily, if she's a year older than I am, I'm probably going to call her Emily-san by default. Because again, it's kind of rude to do yobiste, which is no honorifics at all. Chan can actually be rude. It's a little bit condescending. Chan is usually used to describe children or people that are younger than you, or it's like a very babyish way of calling someone a name. It's especially emasculating and rude to call a man Chan. Kun, likewise, that's a very interesting honorific. It can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, but it's oftentimes the default honorific ending for a boy, not a man, a boy, or a man who is under you, perhaps. You might call him kun. But sometimes females are also called kun because it's also kind of used for colleagues. So yeah, there are all these nuances to all the honorifics out there, and most anime fans do not understand them very well. or they think they understand them, which is even more dangerous than not understanding them, which is why I think it's a disservice to the translation as a whole to leave the honorifics intact. I also don't like how they clutter up the screen and make the subtitles much longer than they need to be. But the problem with leaving the honorifics off entirely of the translation is that oftentimes, especially this is as someone who translates a lot of like otome stuff, like romantic stuff, there's always going to be some significant scene where, oh my god, my love interest called me just by my first name instead of, you know, first name followed by chan or san or whatever, you know. It's like, oh my god, he called me by my first name. That's significant. It's like, well, we can't capture that essence if we are completely omitting the honorifics. So I'm not saying completely ignore the honorifics. I'm saying find an English equivalent to the honorific in the way that the character speaks to the other character. Again, I address this more in my video about honorifics, so check that out. I'm already segueing into my next point, so I'm going to go there all the way. So the third thing that makes it difficult to translate Japanese names is the way in which a person addresses another character does signal a change in their relationship. So the way that the character addresses another character, yeah, that signifies how the relationship dynamic is, who is higher in status, how close they are to one another. And then in turn, if the way they call each other changes, if the honorific changes, or if instead of calling each other by the last name, now they go by the first name, then that can show a shift in your relationship dynamic. And in English, we just don't have that as much. Yes, we have like Ms. and Mr., Doctor, Professor, and we do have first names and last names, but it just doesn't mean the same thing, and there are way more of these variants in Japanese than there are in English. So the whole, oh my god, he called me by my first name instead of my last name thing doesn't work as well in English as it does in Japanese. Number 4 is that names are sometimes used as pronouns. This can get tricky. There are often times, if you've watched enough anime, you probably can think of at least one character who uses his or her own name in place of I as a pronoun. Or you may have noticed when a character is talking to another character, instead of saying anata or omae or you, which can, by the way, be considered rude to like call someone anata or omae or something, like that can be considered rude to say you outright. They'll soften it a little bit by using that person's name. And we just don't do this in English. Like if your name is Jared and I'm talking to you, I wouldn't say, what's Jared's favorite movie? I would say, what's your favorite movie? Maybe I'll say, what's your favorite movie, Jared? But I wouldn't say, what's Jared's favorite movie? And then you wouldn't respond, Jared's favorite movie is Terminator 2. You would probably say, my favorite movie is Terminator 2. If you use your own name in place of personal pronouns, that's considered kind of weird, silly, or arrogant in English, but not so in Japanese. It's kind of normal. It's a little whimsical, a little sing-songy to use your own name as your me pronoun, but it is not at all weird to use somebody else's name as their you pronoun, or as a he or she pronoun, or a gender-neutral pronoun for a third party. You often just use a name instead of a pronoun. So that can be challenging with anime subtitles in particular, because if the viewer of the anime is listening along and hears, oh, that character used that other character's name, but then they don't see the actual name in the subtitles because that name was being used as a pronoun, then the viewer of the anime might think, oh, well, that's a wrong translation because they left out the name. And it's like, no, the name was just a pronoun. So the fifth challenge in translating names is sometimes the names actually mean things. Now, that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. Most anime fans tend to know this, but non-anime fans might have heard that Japanese names mean something, and they think that Japanese names always mean something and that they literally mean something. Like that the name Akiko means something on its own, even though what it really is the kanji that make up the name Akiko each means something, and then maybe altogether they mean something that makes sense, and maybe they don't make sense altogether. But sometimes character names actually mean something like a word. A great case for this is Usagi in Sailor Moon. The title character is in fact named Bunny or Rabbit, and what gets lost is Usagi is not really a common name in Japanese. I mean, it might be a little more common by now because like people who grew up loving Sailor Moon have had children, and maybe some of them named their children Usagi. But Usagi is not a very common, name. It's not really a name for a girl. It's kind of as uncommon as the name Bunny would be. Like I know some girls in the United States probably are named Bunny, or at least their nickname is Bunny. And this is significant in Sailor Moon because in Japanese folklore they have this story where rabbits are up on the moon toasting mochi. Kind of like in Western culture, we have the legend that the moon is made of cheese. In Japan, it's bunnies are on the moon. But this gets lost on us because we don't have that folklore that, oh, rabbits are on the moon. So the whole thing that her name is Bunny is lost on us. The whole rabbit imagery, the fact that she has like bunnies all over her room, that's kind of like an Easter egg for Japanese folks, but it completely gets lost on us unless you include a translator note. But even if you have a translator note, it just isn't going to have the same personal connection and the same emotional significance that it does to Japanese folks. Now, the cool thing, though, about Bunny specifically as a name, and I think it was Viz manga that did translate her name as Bunny instead of Serena like the DIC dub did. The cool thing is she has buns in her head, so I mean the pun still actually kind of works in that case. But for example, like Minako, her name on itself, like Minako itself, doesn't mean anything, but the kanji that make up her name are, the way they can be pronounced is Binasu, which is Venus, so that's like a hidden Easter egg about her name, and they also mean like beautiful girl. And Venus is the goddess of love and beauty, and her last name, I know, the I in there is love. So I know Minako is like Venus of love, is kind of what her name means. So her name is also kind of a pun, which gets lost. So that can be a challenge. Do you keep the name in Japanese and leave translator notes talking about all the punnery and significance of the name, or do you translate that name into English and upset the weebs? So the seventh challenge in translating Japanese names is, in Japanese, they use more honorific terms than we do to describe people. Example, we would sometimes call your doctor, we would address your doctor as just doctor. I don't have to say Dr. Diefegard, I can just say doctor. Like, doctor, when am I going to feel better? It's like I can just call my doctor doctor and it's not really considered rude. Whereas like if a garbage man is coming by and collecting the trash, I can't be like, hey garbage man, when are you gonna collect my trash? That's kind of rude. Mom, dad, you can call your mom and dad, and in fact it's considered rude to call them by their first name. But in Japan they have more terms that it's acceptable to call a person by that we just don't particularly have. Like a very common one is ona, which is the borrowed English word owner, and basically any proprietor of any store, you can just call that person ona. Without even any honorifics. I mean, Ona-san is kind of nicer, but Ona, yeah, like you can just call them that. Whereas we don't do that in English. You can't be like, hey, owner, good to see you again. Like, that's so weird. Sensei, of course, is another hugely common one, and everybody knows Sensei, even non-anime fans. But yeah, we don't necessarily call our teachers just teacher. Professor is what we would call them, but that's only for college folks. So yeah, it's a little bit rude actually to say, hey teacher, can you help me with this? You use the person's name. Another one that's really tough is brother, sister, big brother, little sister, big sister. In English, we don't really use those terms. We used to, like in very old literature, you might have a character call another character big brother or something, and it's not at all clunky. But when I see characters subtitle like, well, hi brother, how is it going today? And it's a contemporary anime, it's just so weird. Like, we don't talk like that. And the last challenge for translating names in games and anime is actually that they use names so much more often in Japanese in everyday life than we do in our everyday life. And then on top of that, in scripted stories on TV, in movies, people just generally use names more often, and the reason why is so that the viewers of the series can be reminded of what the characters' names are, and so they can know, oh yes, that character is Akiko, that character is Shinichi. It's like, and you know their names. But in reality, we don't really use each other's names that much when we're talking to each other. I know, at least for me, like, I feel very self-conscious and uncomfortable calling anyone by name or using anyone's name. Like, if I'm talking to my boyfriend, I'm not like, good morning, Joshua, it's good to see you today. Or like, hey, Joshua, I made you some dinner. Like, in Japanese dialogue, they would be saying that. They'd be using his name. The anime version of me would be using his name. But in real life, I don't do that. It's like weird. And already using somebody's name does kind of bring some sort of closeness or some kind of forced closeness. So it sometimes feels a little fake just using names at all in any way, shape, or form in a translation to begin with. So those are my thoughts on anime and game names. Bye for now. Oh, hi! Thanks for watching that video. If you want to support me for free, like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. You can also add me on the Facebook or the Twitter. Or you can head over to my Etsy shop where I have Sailor Moon, Ai no Minako, and all sorts of other amigurumi for sale. If you're feeling even more generous, I have a Patreon now. For just $1 or $2 a month, you can get special perks like your name in the credits, or a secret monthly video. Or, you know, you could just binge watch all my videos to the end, trick the almighty algorithm into thinking that I'm popular. Do it for the kitties! Bye!